1970s, we had the Roe v. Wade decision in the United States. It was a decision relating to a woman's right to have abortion. It introduced the trimester framework. It basically allowed first trimester abortions, made it very difficult to have third trimester abortions. Essentially, this was really met very quickly thereafter with a sort of backlash. And really, the last 40, 50 years of American history have more or less been a backlash against Roe v. Wade and an attempt to kind of criminalize abortion in all sorts of interesting ways without overturning the decision patient. So that's kind of the legal playing field. We can talk about some of the specifics, but the more interesting question, I think, is thinking about the morality of abortion. And I'll say that I think abortion is an extremely difficult question. So one of the first questions people have to think about is, are fetuses persons? And that's a very important linguistic question. Persons. I didn't say human beings. I didn't say alive. Those are three different issues, right? Something can be alive but not be a person. Your dog is a good example. You love your dog. It's a wonderful thing, but it's not a person. Something can be human and potentially not be a person, right? Some people think the early embryo, for example, before 14 days, or stem cells being derived, are members of the human species, but may not be persons. So what do we mean by persons? We mean something that has a certain set of moral and or legal rights, the most important of which is a right against inviolability. They can't be killed or destroyed or harmed without a very good reason. And we have the attitude that we are all persons, right? So we have an index case, we're pretty clear we're persons. And the question is, who else is a person? Well, to answer that, you need to have a theory about what makes something a person. And there are a few different kinds of theories you can have. One could be just to say, if X is living and a human being, X is a person, right? Now, some people have problems with that. So Peter Singer and some animal rights advocates, for example, think that that's a speciesist attitude. And by saying human equals person, well, it's problematic that we're excluding animals. Instead, we ought to have some criteria that looks at capacity. So other people have sometimes what are called a capacity X view, where they say, in order to be a person, you have to have X capacity. And then we have to fill in what X is. Is it the ability to think complex thoughts, the ability to plan and look towards the future, the ability to feel pain, whether you understand it? It's about continuity of an identity over time, or is it merely being alive and breathing? And some people think it's a single criteria, others think it's a compound criteria. And then there are complex questions about what happens for things that have the potential to have capacity X, or had capacity X but lost it. So for example, a fetus doesn't have the ability, it's early fetus, let's just say an embryo, just to make it very easy. An embryo before 14 days doesn't have the capacity to think deep thoughts about the future, have future orientation. I think that's pretty well accepted by everyone. But it certainly has the potential to do so, right? And the question is that enough? What kind of theory of potentiality? You know, hydrogen and oxygen each have the potential together to become water. But does that mean that they are water, they have the metaphysical properties of water? Or do we require more of a kind of potentiality, something like in the natural course of things, you will become something? The other difficult set of categories are things that once had the capacity but now no longer have it and perhaps never will again. So those that are brain dead, for example, are a good example. They are certainly human beings. In most cases, they have been persons. But now if your capacity for personhood, how you define personhood, is something like the capacity to think deep thoughts about the future or to have future orientation, these are entities that no longer have that capacity and we don't believe will have it again. Do they cease being persons at that point? This is to say that in order to understand whether a fetus or an early embryo, the kind that are used for stem cell derivation, is a person, you have to do a lot of metaphysical work in understanding what makes something a person and why, and what those capacities are. Now, even if you think something is a person, that doesn't necessarily mean you've solved the abortion problem. So it's possible, although popular among philosophers, not so popular in the political press, to say fetuses are persons, and yet abortion is still legal and justified. How does that argument go? The suggestion is that there is a right of another entity that has overcome whatever interest the fetus has, and that is the right typically of the mother who is gestating the fetus. So the claim is, yes, a fetus is a person. Yes, abortion will cause the death of a person, but that doesn't mean that abortion is wrong because the woman gestating the fetus has a right to stop that gestating, even if it will result in the death of a person. And the most famous version of this argument comes from Judith Jarvis Thomson, a very famous thought experiment about the world's most famous violinist. And she says, imagine you find yourself, had a heavy night of drinking, got drunk, you blacked out, and you wake up the next morning and you find yourself a human dialysis machine hooked up to the world's most famous violinist. Nobody doubts the violinist is a person. Right? He's not only a person, a great person, the world's most famous violinist. But she says, don't you have the right to unplug yourself from that person, even if it will turn out that it will result in the death of the violinist? And she says, if you think the answer is yes, then you think that even though the entity is a person, you may have a right to cause its death, a right to unplug itself. And she analogizes that to the right of a mother to unplug herself from her fetus who is a person. Now, there's lots of contestation about that thought experiment, right? You might say, you got drunk, no fault of your own, somebody kidnapped you. Is that really the situation of all women who become pregnant, or is it the situation only of women, for example, who are raped or who are impregnated in an unconscious state? But this is just to show that there's some complexity. Okay, one more point. That is that the stem cell question looks different on this regard. Remember, when we're talking about embryos, we're talking about embryos that are frozen, that are in a lab. Nobody is gestating. If embryos have the rights of persons, unlike in the case of abortion, that nobody has a contrary right to stop gestating. So you might actually think the argument for prohibition against destroying early embryos is easier than the argument for prohibiting abortion for this reason. Now, on the flip side, you might think the early embryos have even...
I'm Dr. Norman McLean. I did practice within obstetrics and gynecology for nearly 40 years. I've done in the area of maybe 8,000 births. That would include maybe 2,000 cesarean sections. I have performed abortions early in my career. Over that time, I would have certainly done between 1 and 200 terminations of pregnancy. So I know about the technique. I am going to describe a second trimester surgical abortion. This procedure is called dilatation and evacuation. It is performed between usually 13 to 14 weeks and 24 weeks of pregnancy. After the patient is given a general anesthetic, the abortionist uses a weighted speculum, one like this, that opens the vagina widely. A late-term abortion requires that the cervix be prepared for 1 to 2 days in advance with either drugs or laminaria. Laminaria is a type of sterilized seaweed that absorbs water over 8 to 12 hours and swells to several times its original diameter. Once the laminaria is removed, the cervix will be further dilated using metal dilators, graduated metal dilators. Once the cervix is stretched open, a suction tube is placed inside the womb. This is connected to a suction apparatus similar to a vacuum cleaner but more powerful. The size of a 20-week baby is the size of the length of my hand from the head to the rump, not including the feet. The average baby at this gestation will weigh 500 grams. The suction machine will remove from around the baby the pale yellow amniotic fluid that has been surrounding and protecting the baby. Now, with babies this big, they won't fit through a suction catheter. The baby's bones and skull are quite strong. They cannot be torn apart by the suction alone. The instrument used to carry out the termination of pregnancy is a forceps, a grasping forceps. It is a metal high-quality instrument, 13 inches or so in length. The active end of the instrument is about 2.5 inches in length, and it has teeth within the instrument which, when it grasps a structure, will not let it go easily. The abortionist uses this clamp to grasp an arm or a leg. Once he has a firm grip, the abortionist pulls hard in order to tear the limb from the body of the baby. One by one, the rest of the limbs are removed along with other body organs, the intestines, the spine, the heart and the lungs. Usually the most difficult part of the procedure is extracting the baby's head, because at this stage of pregnancy the baby's head will be the size of an average plum. It simply won't come through the cervix. In order that this is removed, one needs to crush the skull. This requires inserting the grasping forceps and placing it around the head and crushing the baby's head. That will, of course, cause damage and injury to the skull bones, and one will know that one has achieved that by observing a yellowish, creamy fluid moving through the cervix. That will be the brains of the baby. The abortionist then removes all of the skull pieces. He then removes the placenta and any other leftovers of the baby with a curette which scrapes the lining of the uterus. The abortionist then will collect the various parts of the body and reassemble them to check that there are 2 arms, 2 legs, and so on. Once all the parts have been accounted for, the abortion procedure is complete. For the woman, this procedure carries significant risks. Major complications can occur, including perforation of the uterus or laceration of the cervix, with possible damage to the bladder, the bowel, and other maternal organs. Infection and hemorrhage can also occur and is not rare. These complications can lead to massive hemorrhage, septicemia, and include death. Future pregnancies are also a greater risk for loss because of premature delivery due to abortion-related trauma and injury to the cervix and uterus. What I have described is an operation that will be done from 14 weeks of pregnancy through to 24 weeks of pregnancy. It's very gruesome. The reality of abortion, particularly second trimester, is very gruesome. I stopped doing abortions because I realized this is not right, and this is not what I should be doing. This is not the medicine, the life-giving, healing medicine that I wanted to practice. And from that day, I stopped.
Hi, I'm Caleb, and my question is, what does the Bible really say about abortion?
Thank you, Caleb, for your question about abortion. Welcome everyone to this program that's in the Bible. Let's begin first with getting at a common definition of abortion. We look at the dictionary and it says, well, it's a deliberate termination of a human pregnancy. You know, Caleb, in so many countries, abortion is seen, well, as a mother's choice, and it's most often legal, and it's considered to be a common method of ending the life of a growing child. But here's the thing. Should it really be considered as a viable method of birth control? And by the way, is it really a common practice? Before we turn to the pages of the Bible for some very important guidance, as well as the laws of God about this topic, let's first see how common this practice really is and its place that it currently holds in popular culture. Let's take a look at this clip.
80% of the public is against an abortion in the 3rd trimester, and almost 65% is against an abortion in the 2nd trimester. So people are divided on this.
But I would hope that other people respect the very painful and difficult choice that many women feel they have to make, and don't want the government telling them what they have to do.
So here you can see not only some basic statistics, but you can also notice how truly divided the public is on this issue. There's a lot of different viewpoints that people take regarding this topic. So, Caleb, let's state from the outset the stand of the Galatian Christian Church of Christ. We are truly against abortion as a birth control method. Why? Because it involves the taking away of human life. And God expressly prohibits us from taking another's life or committing murder. What does the Bible actually say about the ending of another's life? Let's begin taking a look at the Bible stand regarding these topics. For example, we begin here in the book of Genesis. Genesis chapter 9, verse 6. If anyone takes a human life, that person's life will also be taken by human hands. For God made human beings in his own image. So Caleb, God's answer is very clear. What was his instruction? We are not allowed to take another human's life. And was God's instruction further reinforced or relayed by our Lord Jesus Christ to the church? By the way, there's no denying that Jesus was the most compassionate of all, because that's what the one gentleman mentioned there, right? He's like, have compassion. Jesus was the most compassionate of all. What about the compassion they were saying? What about the compassion of the mother's situation? Jesus, like I said, was the most compassionate of all people. Compassion being a common reason that supporters of the legalization of abortion, they always reference that. Here's the most compassionate of all, Jesus himself answering that question. In Matthew 19:17 through 19, why ask me about what is good? Jesus replied, there is only one who is good. To answer your question, if you want to receive eternal life, keep the commandments. Which ones? The man asked. And Jesus replied, you must not murder. You must not commit adultery. You must not steal. You must not testify falsely. Honor your father and mother. Love your neighbor as yourself. So here, Caleb, Jesus reiterated God's original instruction not to take the life of another human being. But some may argue that, well, a fetus is not yet a human being. And well, therefore, not yet under the umbrella of God's authority. And therefore, the mother, well, she has the right to choose then to end the existence of that unborn fetus. They will say that's not a human being yet. It's just a conglomeration of cells. That's why we find in society the well-accepted idea of pro-choice. And there's also, some supporters of the pro-choice movement that are also anti-abortion, claiming that, well, a woman's access to abortion, albeit is a human right in cases of rape, cases of incest, or, for example, when their own life is in jeopardy. The stance of the Iglesia de Cristo, however, remains the same, even in these instances, regardless of the medical situation or the irreverent means or crime of the adults. God's act of creation still exists and should not be retaliated against by another crime in the eyes of God. But at what point has creation happened? That's really the fundamental question, isn't it? And it's at what point is the creation begun, and therefore that individual is under God's authority, and the prohibition against murder or taking the life of that human being is in effect. Isaiah the prophet writes a response to that question here, Isaiah 49, verse 5. And now the Lord speaks, the one who formed me in my mother's womb to be his servant, who commissioned me to bring Israel back to him. The Lord has honored me, and my God has given me strength. So clearly, Caleb, since the moment of formation in the womb of the mother, God has been involved. Abortion would thwart then the plan of God in creating that human being. Similarly, abortifacients, contraceptives that cause the unborn fetus to be expelled from the womb of the mother, are not considered as a Christian family planning method. Whether they're legal or illegal, we cannot agree with such methods. Why not? Well, as we just read, God formed us right there in the womb of our mother. Removing such then is fighting against the plan and intent of God Himself. So instead, the Church of Christ upholds birth control and family planning through artificial methods. This is in agreement with the commandment of God given in the Holy Scriptures that man subdue the earth. And what does God give as instructions or specifics about this? In Genesis chapter 1, the Bible says this. Then God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it. And we all know the meaning of the word subdue. In fact, if we look in a thesaurus, some synonyms will be keep under control, moderate, repress, restrain, suppress, reduce.